Hello there. Here we are with the first proper video in the Battlecruiser miniseries. This video will, as previously mentioned, focus largely on the development of the concept itself and why it came into being. We will look at the genesis of the idea and talk briefly on how it came up in multiple different countries for different reasons, though the more detailed breakdowns will come in their own videos. In this regard, the first video will be rather shorter than the individual country breakdowns. To begin, the concept of a battlecruiser is a relatively simple one, at least on the surface. A ship with the guns of a battleship, armored against cruiser guns, and designed to be faster than anything that can outgun her, and outgunning anything fast enough to keep up. Or so is the popular conception of the battlecruiser at any rate. When you look deeper than the Wikipedia, or meme, understanding of it, you quickly discover the concept is not quite so simple. Now, certainly, the genesis of the concept fits the base understanding rather well, though again, it's not so simple when you move past the very first battlecruisers, and I do mean the very first. That being said, battlecruisers began in the Royal Navy as an outgrowth of what are called armored cruisers, intended to function as scouts for the fleet, counters to the enemy scouts, which are also cruisers, and for commerce protection. And the odd commerce rating, though that's more other countries than Britain. All the traditional roles by that point of the larger cruisers. Now, for those unfamiliar, though I'm not going to go in huge detail here, armored cruisers are known as such because they had belt armor similar to battleships, albeit much, much lighter. They typically carried heavy guns, though only very rarely larger than the secondary battleship guns. The most notable exception here being the Japanese, and I apologize because I am going to butcher this pronunciation terribly, Tsukuba and Ibuki classes, armed with 12-inch guns and a typical pre-dreadnought layout of two twin turrets, and a heavy secondary battery, depending on the class, of either 6 or 8-inch guns. Most armored cruisers would never have guns that big. They ranged from 10-inch on the high end, like the American Tennessee class, to 8-inch, which was far more typical, for their main battery, and some weird middle ground calibers like 7-inch or 9.2-inch, but you get the general idea. These ships, sometimes pressed into the line of battle with their battleship counterparts, were typically intended as flagships of foreign stations and as commerce raiders or, again, commerce protection. This is, I repeat, a gross oversimplification, and I will likely need to do a video on armored cruisers for more detail. It does work here, though. The first battlecruisers were the Invincible class. These three ships were fundamentally the armored cruiser taken to its logical conclusion. A ship that was heavily armed, lighter armored than a battleship, and faster than any battleship afloat. In more direct terms, these ships were lighter armored than Dreadnought, the equivalent battleship of their time, carried one less main battery turret, but had the same all-big gun concept of 12-inch guns and a negligible secondary battery. The genesis of these ships can largely be owed to Jackie Fisher, the first Sea Lord, and a man famous, or perhaps more likely infamous, for his obsession with lightly armed and fast capital ships. Or, if you want to go for the memes, speed is armor. It's kind of a funny thing with historians to make fun of Jackie Fisher for that, honestly. He didn't help his case, though, because Fisher, in point of fact, would have rather liked ditching battleships entirely in favor of armored cruisers. There's a nice quote here that I'll be getting into when I do the British battlecruiser video that sums up basically entirely his thought process. Now, bear in mind that that's an impossible dream in the Royal Navy, who at the time was very fond of their big gun battleships. So Fisher settled instead for the development of Dreadnought, herself a ship faster than her predecessors at 21 knots, and 3 large armored cruisers. These 3 ships, the Invincibles again, were designated even as armored cruisers during their design, construction, and early service. However, while these ships were the logical conclusion of armored cruiser development in some ways, in several other ways, they were something completely and utterly new to naval development. Again, with the exception of the Japanese ships that had pre-dreadnought layout, armored cruisers did not ever carry battleship main batteries. Even SMS Blucher, the ultimate culmination of the concept, carried 8-inch guns, more or less. The large American cruisers, as I mentioned before, carried 10-inch guns, which are not battleship caliber. They're bigger than most cruiser guns, but they're not battleship guns. It is, perhaps, telling that the Japanese reclassified their large armored cruisers as battlecruisers once the concept came into vogue. Of course, those ships were very much not battlecruisers, yet it's still a telling sign. Also a later hint to the Japanese designating ships as different classes when they refit them, but that's a story for the Japanese video. In carrying the same armament as Dreadnought, albeit with fewer guns, the Invincibles were a step beyond traditional armored cruisers. In role, they continued the British doctrine of commerce protection and serving in roles battleships were not fit for. This is why I bring up the fact that they were the development of the armored cruiser concept. Invincible was intended to scout for the fleet, hunt other cruisers down, and protect commerce from cruiser raids. In this, she was doing exactly what the British had intended for their previous armored cruisers. Albeit that she was far and away larger than those ships, and far more expensive. Armored cruisers, going back a tick here, were typically nearly as expensive as battleships. In fact, some countries, like Italy and Japan, built the armored cruisers because they couldn't afford battleships, and they figured, they're not that far off in capability, so we'll get the same use out of them. The thing of it is, though, battlecruisers are even more expensive than that. Battlecruisers oftentimes, would be more expensive than equivalent battleships, because it costs a lot of money, surprise, surprise, to build ships that are longer, faster, and at almost as heavily armed as battleships. This would eventually be part of why the concept of battlecruisers went away to be replaced with the concept of fast battleships. If you're spending as much money or more money as a battleship anyway, why not just make the ship have the same armor as the battleship in the first place? Kaiser Wilhelm, as we'll get into in the German section of the series, was quite a fan of this idea, setting battlecruisers aside and just making fast battleships. But that is for the future. For now, back to the Invincibles, which, in design, were a firm break from previous design practice, even if they were supposed to follow the same armored cruiser doctrine. They no longer carried lighter weapons. Their armor protection was, if lighter than a battleship, at 7 inches greater than the majority of armored cruisers. They were larger, more expensive, in just about every way that mattered, and the British would acknowledge this eventually. They were less cruisers and more capital ships. This is, in large part, why the term battlecruiser even came into being. Battleship, as a term, came around from line of battle ship. Ships of the line were called line of battleship, and their successors in the concept were battleships. Now, Invincible may have begun as an armored cruiser, but she would quickly be considered a capital ship alongside Dreadnought. And if you're a capital ship, you're not an armored cruiser. So what are you going to call the ship? Well, it's a cruiser that may have to fight in the line of battle, like a battleship, so why not call them battlecruisers? Now that's a simplification again, but gets the point across, and I'll go into more detail on the linguistics of this all. When I get to the British battlecruiser video. The term battlecruiser would come into usage towards the end of the 1900s and into the 1910s. whereupon the Royal Navy would officially declare that all ships from Invincible onward of her type would be called battlecruisers. Now, jumping ahead a bit in history, the British have a weird thing with calling literally any ship faster than 25-ish knots a battlecruiser. Even HMS Vanguard, the last battleship they built, was often called a fully armored battlecruiser. The British are weird about this, which we'll get into, but most people know what a battlecruiser is and what a battleship is. They're just British, I guess. They're weird. It is here then that we come back to the start of the video. Remember what the concept was? A battlecruiser is a ship with the guns of a battleship, armored against cruisers, and faster than any ship that can outgun her. Invincible, here, fits that to a T. Her firepower was near enough to Dreadnought, her armor protection was lighter than a battleship, but heavier than most armored cruisers, and she was faster at around 25-ish knots, 25, 26, depending on a good day, than any battleship that could hope to outgun her. Why, then, do I say that it isn't so simple? Well, if you ask, it's here where things get a bit more complicated in battlecruiser development. What started as an outgrowth of armored cruisers, at least in the Royal Navy, quickly got out of hand once other people realized what Invincible actually was. The Germans, who had built Blucher largely on what they thought Invincible would be, saw how outclassed she was and built their first battlecruiser, SMS Von der Tann, as a direct counter to Invincible. A ship that was, if slightly slower than Invincible, much heavier armored and armed with an equivalent battleship caliber with fewer guns layout. Though because she's German, and the Germans were fans of smaller caliber guns, she used 11-inch guns instead of 12-inch. Still battleship guns, but relatively small. That would be the common theme and the genesis of German battlecruiser design practice. To go into slight detail on that, though the video on the German ships will cover it in more detail, with less money and fewer dockyards and resources to hand, German battlecruisers became something quite unlike the British ones. Typically a bit slower, but with far heavier armor and lighter guns. These ships were intended to fight in the line of battle as much as they were direct counters to British battlecruisers. They were certainly not armored against chess cruisers. In fact, they often had near enough equivalent armor to the same battleship class of the time. When you get into Seydlitz or Derflinger, they actually really do have battleship-grade armor, just with slightly less coverage. And they weren't necessarily faster than any ship that could outgun them. Battleships, yes, but they were slower than British battlecruisers, who most certainly did outgun them. Again, slower than that, but faster than most battleships. That didn't really endear them to commerce rating or things like that. German battlecruisers were, as much as anything, direct counters to British battlecruisers, and intended, if they needed to fight in the battle line because the Germans could not afford to build ships for anything but battle line role if they were that big. British battlecruisers, beyond Invincible and her immediate successors, would also break from the initial concept. From HMS Lion onwards, they became something more akin to a battleship with one less turret and lighter armor in exchange for speed. You may be wondering why this is different from Invincible. That, if you ask me, is pretty simple. Invincible was, as said a couple times now, designed and built as an armored cruiser. Lion and On were designed and built as a battle cruiser. Invincible was, in her initial genesis, a cruiser. Lion was, from the start, a capital ship. I'm sure this probably feels a bit nitpicky to some people, and perhaps it is, but it's the case nonetheless. The so-called Splendid Cats, Lion, Queen Mary, Tiger, all of those ships, had lighter armor than a battleship, yet their armor was heavier than Invincible at about 9 inches, varying between ships, and were basically a battlecruiser equivalent to the battleship of that year. In fact, the Royal Navy even ordered them as such. They would typically do a class of battleship, or a squadron thereof, and a battlecruiser alongside them when they did their yearly ship orders. The battlecruiser would be, in simplest terms, the battleship with concessions made in armor and firepower to gain speed. For example, Lion is basically a King George V with, original King George V, I should say, with one less turret and less armor. Japanese design concept, from the start, was similar to the Cats. In fact, the Congos and HMS Tiger have very similar layouts, to the point you could get confused between them if you didn't know them very well. Japanese intended their battlecruisers to be capital ships from the word go. Such was arguably also the case with the Russians, the only other ones who actually got any significant progress in to build a battlecruiser, though arguably not the Americans, who built the Lexingtons as supersized scout cruisers. Thus, as we get to the end of this video, the battlecruiser began as a armored cruiser with battleship guns, and developed into a battleship with less armor and guns. See where the difference is now? From building up from a cruiser to building down from a battleship. Again, it's kind of simplifying some very complicated design choices. But as said, this video is just a basic background. Moving forward from here, the next video will cover British battlecruiser design and concept in more detail. Expect much more comments on how to change from Invincible to Lion went. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe if you are interested in seeing the further discussion of battlecruisers and other historic topics. See you in the next video.